Thank you very much to INET for inviting me to participate on this panel on, notice the name, equity, adjustment, and balance in the world economy. And since it is late, we could well make it a very brief session, because there is very little equity, very little adjustment, and very little balance in the world economy. But of course, that would not be kind to you. We have all stayed awake through a long, fruitful, but in the end a bit tiring weekend. So let me try to say a few things about what I've learned this weekend and about the issues. And I want to do so from the point of view of what I'm going to call the innocent bystanders. Bystanders in this debate about where the world economy should be going. In this conference, we've spoken a lot about the challenges facing the United States. We have spoken a lot about the rise of China. We have given Europe one session. And we have hardly said anything at all, or much at all, about the rest of the world. Now, let me provide my own idiosyncratic and highly unjustifiable definition of the rest of the world. The rest of the world that I do want to talk about comprises the emerging nations of East Asia, ex-China, of course, the emerging nations of Latin America, the emerging nation of South Africa, and the emerged nations of Australia and New Zealand. That is my rest of the world. What do these countries have in common? Well, they're open. They're open to trade. They're open to finance. And most of them, not all certainly, not some countries in East Asia, have lots of natural resources. So one reaction might be to say, well, these countries are in fact having a very good time. No need to talk about them. And in some sense, that is true. These are countries that for decades have hoped for two things: high commodity prices, if you produce them, and low interest rates and plenty of capital availability. If you have those things, presumably these countries were to be happy. So one reaction to the rest of the world in a conference like this might be to say, well, watch out what you wish for, you got what you wished for, now get out of the room, shut up. I want to argue that in fact these countries in the rest of the world, in spite of this apparently benign nature of the world economy today, have plenty of things to worry about and plenty of complaints to air. And I just hope to persuade you today that some of those complaints are not entirely groundless. First set of complaints has to do with the non-adjustment or very slow adjustment in the world economy and the persistence of so-called global imbalances. We all know that before the crisis, the IMF does these lovely pictures in the wheel that we all look at. The next one is coming out tomorrow, I think. If you look at that picture, global imbalances were widening and widening and widening before the crisis erupted. And in 2007, the current account surplus of the joint group of surplus countries, Germany, China, Japan, and the oil producers, reached 3% of world GDP, with a correspondent deficit on the other side. These imbalances shrank, of course, as demand collapsed in the UK and the US, etc. But if you look at the previous IMF wheel, they began widening again after 2008. And we will know tomorrow morning whether they are still widening and whether they're expected to widen. But whether they do or not, the fact is that summed over a decade, these have meant for the surplus countries tremendous asset accumulation. $16 trillion today in international reserves and untold trillions in sovereign wealth funds, private funds, etc., etc., etc. Should we care about this? There's one view espoused by my friend Alan Taylor yesterday. He put me up in a picture, so I should not disagree with him, but I will, slightly. One view is that these current account deficits don't really matter very much, because what really matters is domestic financial instability, and you can get the latter without the former, so who cares about current account deficits? Moreover, one might say these imbalances will go away any day soon. Why? Because China has lots of price inflation, lots of wage inflation, and therefore the real exchange rate of China is appreciating. Sooner or later, the imbalances will go away. This is not a problem. That is one view. That is not my view. More relevant to the innocent bystanders is the fact that even if the current account surpluses narrow, as long as they don't go away altogether, net foreign asset positions continue to be built by the surplus countries. And the question is, where in the world are those net asset positions going to be invested as you look forward in time? In the last decade, before 2008, they were invested mostly in Alabama real estate. Or rather, they were invested mostly in pieces of paper that were backed by pieces of paper that were backed by pieces of paper, on and on and on, that eventually was backed by a piece of Alabama real estate. That is, of course, no longer the case. People are not doing that if you're holding large pools of wealth in China or Brazil or Russia or elsewhere. So if you are Brazil today, or if you are many of these countries in the rest of the world, you look out the window and what you see is a tremendous tsunami of wealth coming your way. And this, which once upon a time might have been welcomed, I view, and many people in these countries view, as a terrifying sight indeed. Why? Because this tsunami is going to make your politics very difficult, your life, if you're a minister, very unpleasant, and your macro trade-offs very sharp indeed. Let me give you one number to back up this proposition. In the period between 2000 and 2005, net capital inflows into Latin America on a good year reached about 60 billion for the whole sub-region, and on average they reached 40 billion. Well, last year, 2010, they climbed to almost 270 billion. And the composition shifted massively. Almost all of this used to be FDI. Last year, close to 60% of this was short-term portfolio investment. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers very frightening indeed. In fact, let me play amateur historian for 1 minute and be thoroughly unrigorous. When you see these things, often enough in history, very nasty things happen shortly thereafter. And I worry about that. So, first statement, the persistence of global imbalances and these very large pools of wealth shuffling about are a very scary threat to the so-called rest of the world, or at least my rest of the world. Second concern, the conduct of world monetary policy. China and the US have many differences, but they have one similarity. Actually, perhaps two. Martin Wolf said this morning that they're both plutocracies, so that's one similarity. Let me add a second one. They both carry out domestic monetary policy with no regard whatsoever for external consequences, which, of course, one might say is to be expected. Very few countries in the world pay much attention to the external effects of their own monetary policies, and perhaps we should not expect them to. The problem is, if you're the Maldives or Moldova or El Salvador, this does not matter very much at all. If you are China or if you are the United States, it matters a great deal. In the language of economics, we have a massive externality, and this externality matters. It certainly matters for the innocent bystanders. Look at China for a minute. In the case of China, I suspect it is fairly non-controversial to say that the persistence of this asymmetric world arrangement with lots of floating countries and then some countries that fix retards world adjustment. It does not happen the way the world textbook tells you it should. And of course, it helps these imbalances persist. In the case of US monetary policy, the extremely expansionary current stance is, at least in my view, purely justified on domestic grounds. I was at a meeting the other day with a bunch of investment bankers on Wall Street. One of them said, Ben Bernanke is trying to turn the United States into Zimbabwe. I do not think that is true. That is not fair. That does not make any sense at all. However, the fact that a given monetary policy is appropriate from a domestic point of view, of course, in no way guarantees that the overall global monetary stance is appropriate. And again, from the point of view of these innocent bystanders in this so-called rest of the world, what we have today is very, very far indeed from an appropriate world monetary policy. One does not have to share some of the very overheated rhetoric coming out of some capitals to think that perhaps something arising from Washington is affecting this tremendous wave of liquidity today arriving at the shores of many of these countries. Now, when you make this observation, Federal Reserve officials, Ben Bernanke among them, have been very clear. They've basically said to the complainers, look, guys, let your exchange rate appreciate, stop whining, which is, again, what the textbook, I suppose, would prescribe. But I do not find personally this statement particularly satisfying or does not leave me in a great deal of peace of mind. We all know the standard intro to micro externality story we tell our students. Big factory that spews smoke, little old lady that washes her sheets, and the sheets keep again and again being soiled by the soot in the air. Well, telling the whining countries to simply let your currency appreciate is a bit like telling the little old lady in the neighborhood with the dirty sheets, well, go off and wash your sheets again. I do not find that to be a particularly satisfying answer, and I suspect the little old lady in the neighborhood does not either. So, what are we to do about this? Well, the prevailing view is probably, well, not very much, right? Not realistic at all to ask the Fed, or the People's Bank of China, or the ECB, or any large bank to put anything that is non-local into the objective function that they maximize. That's one reason not to do anything. Moreover, most skeptics would add that sooner or later the main central banks will raise interest rates. In fact, some of them are doing it already. And therefore, this big tsunami of liquidity will stop going to emerging markets, will come back home to where it always belonged, and then the problem will be over. I don't know about you, but again, I do not find this skeptic's view particularly reassuring. Because even if the problem diminishes in magnitude in the months ahead as the Fed and the ECB certainly the ECB, perhaps the Fed, I don't know, the structural deficiency, the systemic deficiency is still there, and it will show up again at some point. Moreover, we economists are not supposed to like externalities, and we're supposed to be thinking in ways, maybe new economic thinking in ways to deal with them. So what is it that we tell our students? We tell our students that if there is an external effect and that is undesirable, we come up with taxes, subsidies that cause the externality to be internalized and the inefficiency to go away. So perhaps we should be thinking of something that looks like taxes or subsidies in this context. What exactly they look like, I frankly have no idea. But this is something that perhaps we ought to be thinking about. And of course, may sound like a wild and crazy idea, but it is not so wild and crazy, or at least so new, because we have all invoked the ghost of Keynes. Let me do so once again. Keynes, of course, was very worried about asymmetries in international adjustment. He worried about surplus countries not having sufficient incentives to adjust. Deficit countries have to, surplus countries do not, and he advocated some kind of a disincentive, some kind of a tax on such surpluses. So this is an old idea. Perhaps we should be giving it a new cast, a new shape. Last, and I will be brief, given these problems, given the imbalances, given the stance of monetary policy, let me tell you just a little bit of what the world looks like if you happen to be sitting in the office of a finance ministry or a central bank in one of these so-called rest of the world countries. First of all, if it is indeed the case that these commodity prices are going to be around for a long time, maybe, I do not know, and if it is indeed the case that real interest rates in the world economy will be lower than they used to be, perhaps, well then some appreciation of your currency is probably inevitable. However, some appreciation of your currency and massive appreciation of your currency are two very different things indeed. I don't quite know how to define massive appreciation, but I can tell you that if you go to Rio and you take a cab from the airport and the cab is just as expensive as it would be in Tokyo or Luxembourg, you may well be getting there. Second issue is that people in these countries will begin to worry about bubbles. When the money went to Alabama, it created a bubble. Now it is going elsewhere, and it may well be creating, or at least there may be the threat of the creation of a bubble somewhere else. Again, let me pursue The Rio example, simply because I was there a couple of weeks ago, you all experienced, no doubt, a few years back that if you went to dinner with your friends in New York or in London, all that people talked about was real estate prices. And suddenly everybody had a $1 million flat. Well, if you go to Rio and you talk to academics, not particularly well-paid academics, every single one of them is sitting on a $1 million flat. And again, this is the kind of thing that happens shortly before other nastier, much nastier things happen. I worry about it as well. My dissertation advisor, Carlos Diaz Alejandro, was once asked, what is an overvalued exchange rate? And he said, I have no idea, but it is a bit like a giraffe. When you see one, you recognize it. As I travel around emerging markets nowadays, I begin to see giraffes almost everywhere. Last but not least, you're going to have some macro troubles. Inflation is high, to some extent because of food prices, to some extent because the output gap is narrowing. This would call for higher interest rates, but the interest rates that you may need may also be interest rates that would call forth such large capital inflows that perhaps those are simply not within the realm of the feasible. So we may have more inflation than we might want in many of these countries. We may also be putting a great deal of weight on fiscal policy, because if monetary policy is not fully available, fiscal policy will have to carry the brunt. I will be done, I promise, in exactly 1 minute. Now, I love counter-cyclical fiscal policy. I spent the last 5 years of my life doing it. But precisely because I've done it, I'm aware of how hard it is to do it. And therefore, a system that is built upon the assumption that you're going to have lots of it in most countries may be a system that is fairly weak indeed. Finally, I think we're going to see unconventional monetary policy and macroprudential regulation go south. They're the big things in the north. They're going to go south. And let me tell you exactly how it will go south. Unconventional monetary policy will go south, and it'll be called exchange rate intervention. What are central bankers thinking? Not saying, because you can't say it out loud. It is not polite. But what they're thinking is monetary policy in the north today means you buy long-dated bonds. In the south, it means you buy dollar-denominated bonds. What is the difference? And macroprudential regulation will go south or east, and it will simply be a way of preventing, or at least creating big disincentives for local banks to borrow abroad. So many things that were not meant in polite company to be macroprudential regulation will be called macroprudential regulation, and the aim will simply be one: keep capital out. So let me wrap it up. One last paragraph. This will confront policymakers in these countries with very unpleasant choices. They will probably be forced to adopt, in some cases, second or third best policies. Inefficiencies will take place. Social costs will have to be paid. But we shouldn't worry about it too much. After all, it is only happening in the rest of the world. Thank you very much.